Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 715, Interview with Russ Baker. This is being recorded on June 6th of the year 2010. Once again, it's my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves Russ Baker, the author of the formidable and vitally important Family of Secrets, subtitled The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Russ, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Thank you very much. Good to be here again.
In this remarkable book, you have documented networking, as I've said so many times in our past interviews. And everywhere one looks with the Bush family, we've looked primarily at Poppy Bush in our first interviews. Everywhere one looks with him, one finds intelligence connections, overlapping and inextricably linked with his business connections. And a point I'd like to stress and highlight as we get into the two interviews we're going to record today. In turn, when one sees Bush electoral politics, one sees, once again, inextricable links with the intelligence community. We have not spoken much about George W. Bush, W or George II, as he's often called. And in these last two interviews, of course, that is going to be the primary focal point. But in discussing the political genesis of George W. Bush, I'd like to reference that to a milieu which you actually formally conceptualized in one section of your book, where you talked about Poppy's web, because indeed it was within Poppy's web that not only the young spider George W. Bush was nurtured, but also another name that is familiar to younger members of the audience, and that is Karl Rove. Tell us about Poppy's web, so to speak, and the raising of the young spider Karl Rove.
Well, sure. And now I have to refresh myself a little bit on the context of this. Okay, so this is when he left the CIA in the...
Actually, just ever so slightly, I think this is actually before he was formally named CIA. But, of course, in our past interviews, we've looked at abundant evidence that he was agency from the get-go professionally, dating back to the immediate post-war period.
The chapter in Family of Secrets called Poppy's Web actually begins as he is left the CIA.
Yep.
And what he does, George H.W. Bush or Poppy Bush, what he does is he tries to convince Jimmy Carter almost desperately to keep him on as director of the agency, and Carter won't do it. So he returns to Texas, and he begins working with a company called First International Bank Shares. And this is one of many interesting banks, of which you would have to include BCCI and a number of others that seem to do sort of interesting international business, shall we say. And another one was called Republic National Bank. And I look at that earlier in Family of Secrets. That's an outfit also in Dallas that had an office tower in which we saw people like George de Mohrenschildt having offices, law firms that did work for the intelligence community and what have you. And so we see these multiple financial entities that all of which are connected to Bush in some ways. But in this case, First International takes him in. And as you pointed out in an earlier program, there's also this Dallas Council on World Affairs, an entity that all these people would sit on it. So you'd see people from Republic and from First International all sitting on these anti-communist groupings, along with people from Dresser Industries, oil companies, and what have you. So it was a very, very tight-knit group. Another one would be Riggs Bank out of Washington, D.C., which has shown up in all kinds of scandals, also involving intelligence. So anyway, Poppy goes to work for this outfit. He, like almost everything else in his life, when asked, could not remember what he did for the bank.
Just like he couldn't remember where he was and what he was doing on November 22nd, 1963, despite the fact that he was certainly in Dallas the night before and very probably that very day.
That's right. And as far as this particular bank goes, we see young George W., works as a clerk bookkeeper at the Houston affiliate. And again, this is training in the family business. And in Family of Secrets, I stress the point that the family business is basically the business of managing the world on behalf of these financial and resource extraction elites. So anyway, First International, closely associated with the Bass, Hunt, and Murchison families. Its largest shareholder, Joe Albritton, ran D.C.'s Riggs Bank, which held the accounts for several embassies, including Saudi Arabia. By the way, Joe Albritton's son now runs the website Politico.
Really?
Yes.
I knew it had a Republican genesis, but I didn't place the name. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Russ.
which is another, interesting thing as we've talked about on earlier programs, and as I get into in Family of Secrets, of course, Time Magazine and Henry Luce, who was in Skull and Bones with Prescott Bush, and were very, very helpful to the Bushes and to the intelligence establishment. Newsweek, I get into a little bit in the book, also connected with the intelligence apparatus. And so this is very, very common because, of course, media is extremely important. And so you find media, banking, intelligence, oil, often all connected. In any case, the people on the board of this bank that Poppy Bush joins, he, by the way, gets involved with their London branch, and that's very interesting. What was the London branch? There was a sense, I should say, of some of the people I interviewed, that the London branch was involved with international cover for the movement of monies that were not to be traced. But the president and the CEO of the London branch, on whose board Poppy sat, was a former FBI agent and an employee of Magnolia Oil, which your listeners may know is a company that provided employment to several figures associated with Lee Harvey Oswald. So anyway, this bank grows during this period that Bush comes on board, and then it ends up merging with this other bank I mentioned, Republic, to become the biggest commercial bank in Texas. What's interesting about it is that 14 months later, the parent holding company fails, resulting in a $3.5 billion federal bailout. Now, the reason I mention that is there's George H.W. Bush deep into this thing. It gets this giant bailout. Of course, by the time he gets a bailout, he has moved on to be in the White House.
And, of course, that perfectly qualified George H.W. Bush to become his work for FIB, as you call it, First International Bank Shares, to become head of the Vice President's Task Force on Financial Deregulation under Reagan, which led to the S&L debacle. But again, Karl Rove is a name that became very well known as, quote, Bush's brain, unquote. But actually it was the Poppy Bush who nurtured the young Rove.
Well, that's right. Karl Rove, back in the early 70s, was involved with the college Republicans, and there was a scandal. There was a battle for the leadership of it. I go into this in a little bit of detail in Family of Secrets. And he is basically accused by one of the other factions of the college Republicans of encouraging dirty tricks. Very interesting early in his career. And so George H.W. Bush in 1973, now chairman of the RNC, Republican National Committee, he is asked to investigate and decide who's telling the truth. And he basically clears Rove of the charges and then promptly hires him as his assistant. And this is very interesting to me. What was it about Karl Rove that, out of all the bright and ambitious young Republicans, that endeared him to Poppy Bush? We don't know. We can only speculate. But, of course, that puts him into the Bush family apparatus. There is a story they like to put out about how he first met W. right around that period. W came back from Harvard Business School, and Rove described how it was his job to meet him at the airport and give him the car keys. I imagine it wasn't so limited an encounter, because obviously they made an impression on each other. And from then on out, he was keeping an eye on and looking at the younger Bush as he put it, as a horse he could ride, as an opportunity to get all the way to the top.
One of the things that I'd like to touch on, too, switching now to the subject of W. Bush, once again, and listeners to this program are familiar up to a point with Arbusto and Harkin, both of which I want to get into in a couple of minutes, but there are a number of early business ventures, and we'll touch on Harvard Business School in a minute, but W, of course, was a Texas Air National Guardsman and ostensible fighter pilot. We talked about that in an earlier interview. But in summer jobs and in some early employment stints, once again, we see not only some of the transgenerational networking, from grandfather to son to grandson, but also, once again, some of the inextricable links with intelligence. You mentioned briefly a job George had with a company called Stratford and with a fellow named Bob Gow. I wonder if you'd touch on that for us.
Sure. Well, Bob is an interesting figure. He had worked first. He was out of that same network of the prep schools and elite Eastern universities, and knew the Bush family, and was offered a job to come work for, I believe, I have to go back and refresh my memory again, and this is all in Family Secrets, but Bob had worked, somehow was connected with the favorite uncle of Poppy Bush, and then he was brought in to work with Poppy at Zapata, and he said some things that were quite interesting. If you study these people carefully enough, they even though they're very circumspect and cautious, they always reveal some things. And so he revealed how Zapata had all of these foreign subsidiaries in Liechtenstein and all these places, which were ideal for moving money. And he described it as just a thing for a corporation to minimize its taxes. But of course, a company that had no profits had no reason to minimize taxes. And so there are literally dozens of offshore entities sound like something else. Whether Bob knew they were something else or not, I don't know. But as I say, he did work for Bush, and he described how much of what the company did was networking with powerful people, which again didn't make a lot of sense for a tiny little offshore drilling company. But Bob also, so Bob worked first for Poppy Bush in this peculiar Zapata offshore, and then started his own company, Stratford, where he then employed the son, George W. And Stratford is another one of these curious things that had, it was buying up companies right and left all over the world. Didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. He talks about how they tried all these different schemes that they could never really make any money. But the company itself just doesn't make any sense to me. And I have to wonder whether it was not some sort of cover for something else, which may explain why George W. Bush, when he worked there, traveled abroad, yet never put that on his resume. And this is interesting because when he ran for president in 2000, he was criticized and even ridiculed for wanting to be president of the United States, yet seemingly having never left the country. And he didn't even try to dispute that, and yet I find that evidence that he was in Jamaica and a number of other countries on behalf of Stratford, and he doesn't talk about it.
One of the things I found quite amusing, at one point you actually quote Robert Gow as saying that under his employment capacity, I've forgotten offhand whether it was Zapata and or Stratford, that he actually, he was explicit about having worked for the CIA in places like Guatemala. And I think it was you, maybe another interviewer that you quoted, but asked him, did he find anything of interest there? And he said, nope. No, nothing there.
He said there was nothing, but he did admit that the way he described it was that he had a plantation and that they asked him to keep his eyes open, and that the agency did, and he was glad to report back to them periodically about how he had never found anything.
Yeah, one of the things that you point out, and again, it's one of the major features of the book, is that when one studies Bush family enterprises, not only are they networking with very powerful corporate interests, many of them household words, but the ventures themselves, and we're going to see the same thing with W, really don't make a lot of sense as business ventures, but as intelligence and money laundering fronts, they make a lot of sense indeed. Let's go back to another early employer of George W. Bush, and I believe this was actually one of the jobs he worked when he was already at Harvard Business School, and that is Alaska Airlines and Neil Barrick. Tell us about them.
Sure. Formerly Alaska International Industries, they had airline and construction operations at the time of the Alaska pipeline boom. And I managed to interview, I think one of the strengths of Family of Secrets is not just that I tell these stories, but that wherever possible, I quote the sources on the record. And so there are almost no anonymous sources in here. And I actually managed, it took some effort, I must say, but I managed to interview the owner of the company, and he told me point blank, the quote is, he was actually a political hire about W. He says that somebody had called from Houston and asked us if we could put George Bush's kid to work for the summer, give him a summer job. And he says, yeah, we did that, and he actually says W wasn't too bad at his job, put together a business plan, which of course he would know how to do from Harvard. But he says he always wondered why he was up there, and he actually says one of the only thing that ever crossed my mind is that he was up here, he was supposed to be in the National Guard someplace. So here's the head of the company saying that he thinks that the father was maybe squirreling the son away. I think we may have talked on an earlier show about how W was clearly basically AWOL from the military, and his father was sort of hiding him out first at Harvard, and that you could hide out at Harvard may seem amazing, but keep in mind he was supposed to be in Houston at the time, and then later shipping him off to Alaska, so then I asked Berg about his company, and the quotes are amazing. We were all over the world, and we did all kinds of weird stuff. We did some spying for the CIA after Jimmy Carter went in, gutted the CIA, and almost ruined them. They came to people like me because they didn't have any money, and by law they couldn't be in some countries. So, and then he says, we did some work for the CIA in Guatemala. I mean, it's just very, very interesting. He mentions Iran-Contra and so on and so forth. And he talks about how they were always brought in by companies that would, that he knew were CIA, but themselves would not quite admit. But it was all one step removed. And it's just very interesting how this works and what an enormous sprawling network we're talking about. I would have to say thousands of such entities, big and small, all over the world. And there's W getting his training and also perhaps hiding out, getting his training at a CIA-connected outfit.
Once again, business and intelligence matters fusing in vis-a-vis the Bush family. Another person you talk about, and this was an Air National Guard associate of Bush that we touched on in one of our last interviews, but this is a guy who also appears to have been recruited by the elder Bush and put to work for the intelligence community /CIA, and that is James R. Bath Skyway and some of the people he was networking with. Let's talk about that, because later on we're going to develop how that once again helped to concretize the George W. Bush business fortunes.
Sure. Well, the background is that James Bath grew up poor in Louisiana. He got into the Air Force. First he was in the Civil Air Patrol in Louisiana, very interesting, right around the same period, more or less, as Lee Harvey Oswald got his initial sort of paramilitary training first as a pilot for the Civil Air Patrol. Civil Air Patrol was started by people in the Rockefeller family, other wealthy families, as a kind of a civilian way of being loyal to the country, and also that it could be activated in wartime. And so it was a kind of an intelligence outfit, you might say. And one of the founders of it was D. Harold Byrd, the owner of the building that housed the Texas School Book Depository at the time that Oswald was employed there and allegedly shot Kennedy. So anyway, there's James Bath out of the same Civil Air Patrol. He joins the Air Force. Jim didn't want to talk too much about what he had done over the years. I got the impression from people I had talked to that he'd served in Vietnam in some secret capacities in air bases out of Thailand. This is early. We're looking at the early 60s when the U.S. was not supposed to be in Vietnam, so they were operating out of these surrogate locations. And so Jim does that. He's in the Air Force, and then he moves to Houston, and he joins the Champaign unit, as we talked about in the earlier show, the same Air National Guard unit that then George W. Bush would join a bit later. And they would immediately become pals, and people almost had a sense that Jim's job was to be some kind of a minder. And that's a term folks know from the intelligence world. A minder is somebody who tags around with you and basically keeps you out of trouble. And so Jim seemed to be some kind of a minder for W, spending a lot of time with him, both in the Guard and outside of it. And he apparently did manage to keep the son out of trouble as much as he could. Very interestingly, when W left the Guard abruptly, long before his flying assignments were up, they used the fact many years later, flash forward 30 years later, and this is all a big controversy, the White House has to call a press conference in the 2004 re-election campaign to try to explain what happened to him and where did he go when he disappeared from the Guard. And so they released a document showing that all it had been was he hadn't taken his physical, and you have to take a physical each year, and he was suspended for flying because of that. The document also had another person on there, the name redacted, but you could see that another person also had not taken their physical, and they used that to say, well, look, here's two guys in the same unit. They both didn't take their physical, so obviously it's no big deal. Well, that was enough for the American media to pretty much say, okay, I guess it's no big deal. Of course, they didn't ask who the other person was, whether the circumstances were related or not. But fortunately, holes in the system, somebody who did a Freedom of Information request had obtained the same document without the other name redacted, and we know the name to be James R. Bath. And so both of them were bumped at the same time for failing to take their flight physicals. Now, Jim would have always taken his flight physical because he was one of the best flyers in the unit. He was a real top dog. He could fly upside down on somebody's wing. I mean, he was fabulous. And so it was a mystery to everyone why he dropped out. But the net effect of it, of course, was that it gave cover to W. Now, we flash forward a few years, and Jim Bath suddenly, he goes into various kinds of aircraft businesses because the National Guard is a part-time thing. But then he suddenly gets a phone call. The story is he gets a phone call, and somebody says, I understand you have this plane for sale. And he goes, you want the plane? It's such a clunker. And they said, yeah, but you got to fly it to us. That's part of the deal. And he said, okay, where am I taking it? And they said, you're taking it to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
Well, isn't that where everybody goes with a little clunker aircraft?
Yeah.
The thing that's so interesting about this period in James R. Bath's career is that once again he appears to have been working for the intelligence community and Poppy Bush, and working as one of the strands in Poppy's web. You speculate specifically about Skyway.
Right. Well, you see all of these entities, and so what happened, just a shorthand, is that he gets together with these two Saudis. One is a member of the bin Laden family. The other is a member of the bin Mahfouz, the very powerful Saudi banking family, both tied in very much with the Saudi royal family. And so using the money coming from these Saudis, he starts all of these operations, which he could never have started himself. Skyways, along with several others, identified as appearing to be involved with the Iran-Contra operation. And so the clear sense is that and I go into, by the way, there are several chapters in Family of Secrets specifically on this Saudi relationship because there's a lot to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But the crux of it is this, is that George H.W. Bush was involved in an effort, which began in the early 70s actually, to form a security alliance with the Saudis. This is beginning at the time of the great oil embargo and those very, very long lines some of us may remember in the United States, and this was was a disaster for the White House, the Republican Party, and the country in general, and it was seen as a national security priority to basically neutralize the Saudis and those with the oil supply so it never happened again. And of course, much of that is what's driving our policy today in Iraq and Afghanistan, the control of these resources. So anyway, Poppy was very involved with that. And one of the things that they were going to do was they appear to have created this back channel, this sort of almost kind of a voluntary shotgun marriage with the Saudis involving as middlemen Jim Bath, bin Mahfouz, and bin Laden. And so what they were doing was these guys, either with their own money or money that probably was coming from the Saudi royal family, agreed, first of all, that they would supply oil at a reliable and steady price to the United States. They also agreed that they would repatriate some of the profits back to the United States. Those profits then ran through, a lot of them through Houston, through banks, one main bank on which Jim Bath and John Connolly and some other interesting figures were on the board, tiny little bank with huge amounts of money running through it. So it appears that they were cycling their petrodollars through Houston with the people from the Bush circle getting their piece of the action, but also that a lot of these monies were going into things like Skyways, which you were mentioning. In other words, a way of funding unauthorized wars, unauthorized covert operations abroad that were again serving the interests of this self-same group.
By the way, you alluded to Skyway and the Iran-Contra affair. Neil Barrick of Alaska Airlines that we looked at earlier, Alaska International Airlines that we looked at earlier, also was quite explicit about having done some work for the Iran-Contra operation. in this time period, let's recall some of the information that we talked about in earlier interviews. There are investigations in the 1970s, we're talking about, of intelligence community misdeeds, CIA in particular. And perhaps the daddy of them all was the Senate, that was the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which along with several other committees was looking into the assassinations of President Kennedy and also Martin Luther King. And by way of sort of setting the cast of characters, a dramatis personae, for the subsequent discussion, let's review briefly the Halloween massacre in which the elder George Bush is placed in charge of the CIA. This at a time when, as we've already discussed, the intelligence community, CIA in particular, is looking for ways to evade public scrutiny, going private, so to speak. The Halloween massacre, Poppy's ascension to CIA director, and also the political genesis of two other names who, along with Karl Rove, figure prominently in the W narrative, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld.
Right. So basically, what I explore in earlier chapters of Family of Secrets is the decision that Richard Nixon was not cooperating anymore, that he was sort of off the reservation, that he needed to go, setting him up through a series of first unsuccessful and then finally successful through the break-in entanglements, orchestrating an effort, we've talked about that on a prior show, to have him removed, and then also to, before they do that, to make sure that somebody's in place who they can count on. So they push Spiro Agnew out first in another scandal. They bring Gerald Ford in, make him vice president. Then they push Nixon out. And so Ford becomes president. Now, he himself is a fairly sort of moderate guy, and I think probably if all things were equal, probably would have done the right thing. But he also was a fellow who knew where some of the bodies were buried and wasn't about to buck these powerful people. They knew that when they put him in. He'd already been on the Warren Commission, where he had done their bidding and influencing the report to suggest improperly that a single bullet could have done the damage that it allegedly did. And so then he becomes president, and he starts trying to assert some of his own independence again, like all of these other people, and quickly, somehow or other, is told that he isn't going to do that. And not only that, but instead of him being more liberal than Nixon, which some people thought, there is a sudden lurch to the right. And basically what happens is these two young men, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld and his protege Dick Cheney, who are there in minor capacities, suddenly they're chief of staff and essentially deputy chief of staff to Ford, and then they cause a shakeup. The deputy chief of staff becomes chief of staff. The chief of staff becomes secretary of defense, and then boom, 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 and the next thing that happens is at CIA, where they got a leaky ship. They've got people on Capitol Hill demanding to know what the heck is this agency all about, what it is it doing, and to try to assert some control over it as they should in a democracy. And of all the people in the whole world that they could bring in, they bring in Poppy Bush, this neophyte who claims no background in intelligence, and they bring him back from China, where he's basically a kind of a powerless token figure as envoy there. That was supposed to be on his resume and make him look good, and I assume he was up to some things there, but he himself admits he did very little in the actual diplomacy with the Chinese. But anyway, they bring him back to the U.S., and suddenly here he is installed at the helm of the agency in this most critical of years.
Russ, we are almost out of time on this side, but tell us about Family of Secrets, where people can get the book on your website.
Okay, Family of Secrets, subtitle The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Your local bookstore should have it. If they don't, bug them a bit and they'll order it. You can get it online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can go to our website, familyofsecrets.com. You can click there and order it. We also have our nonprofit investigative reporting site, which is, we hope, the future of journalism, whowhatwhy.com, whowhatwhy.com.
And want to hear more? Good. Stay tuned for Side 2, because this concludes Side 1 of For the Record program number 715, interview with Russ Baker. This has been recorded on June 6th of the year 2010. For Russ Baker, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening. Hello, my name is Dave Emory, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 715, Interview with Russ Baker. This is being recorded on June 6th of the year 2010. Once again, it's my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves the author of the formidable and consummately important book, Family of Secrets, subtitled The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Russ Baker, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Now, we're talking here in the 1970s. The intelligence community is under investigation by congressional committees. This is in the wake of Watergate, which itself almost certainly appears to have been an intelligence operation in which the elder George Bush was deeply involved, what author Len Kolodny called a silent coup. And perhaps the most potentially significant of all of these investigations were the overlapping investigations, including the House Select Committee investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy, in which the elder George Bush appears to have been involved. He just couldn't seem to remember where he was and what he was doing that day, despite the fact that he was in Dallas, certainly the night before and probably that very day, and going to great lengths, as you point out in an entire chapter, to cover up where he was and what he was doing. So on November 1st, Warren Commission member Gerald Ford is president of the United States, and he makes a number of moves at this time, bringing in not only George H.W. Bush to become director of Central Intelligence at this sensitive time, but also two other names that are figured prominently in the narratives of both Georges Bush, including and especially the younger, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Introduce those names for us again, Russ.
Right. Rumsfeld was a very ambitious fellow who had a job in the Nixon administration. When Ford came in, he was made Ford's chief of staff, and his deputy was a young fellow named Dick Cheney. And after this, beer hall putsch, where they forced out a lot of the more moderate people, Rumsfeld became defense secretary, and Cheney moved up to be White House chief of staff. Interestingly, also, by the way, Kissinger was who had held both the positions of National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, was pushed out of the National Security Advisor position in favor of the Air Force Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, another name of people very, very close with Poppy Bush, who would figure in later administrations. And so that is very, very interesting. Then you see the 1976 re-election campaign, and they forced Nelson Rockefeller, a moderate, off of the ticket in favor of Bob Dole. And Bush told the press that this whole thing was his own idea, which nobody believes. But what happened was they immediately lurched to the right. And U.S. policy, which had been one of détente and of openness and of outreach to America's Cold War enemies, suddenly moved to one that would be much more like the policy we would see under Ronald Reagan. And they would also shift away from intelligence assessments that indicated that the Soviets were not that great a threat, intelligence assessments that were in support of efforts to control the risk of nuclear war. And so all of these guys are critical players in this shift. This was something that appears to have been engineered again by this same military-industrial complex that former General Dwight Eisenhower warned about. And Poppy Bush, again, a player in that whole thing. As CIA director, one of the first things he does is he puts in a second analytical team. They call it Team B, and it presents alternative scenarios to counteract the CIA analysts, who many of them feel are too soft and too moderate. So that's all going on. Very interesting, of course, because Rumsfeld and Cheney and Scowcroft would reappear some years later when George H.W. becomes president, and then several of them would reappear years later again when George W. Bush becomes president. Be definitive in steering American policy in recent years.
Another name we should introduce briefly at this point that will be familiar to younger listeners, well, older and younger listeners, but it was in the milieu of Team B, these scary storytellers about the former Soviet Union, brought in by George H.W. Bush, that we see the political genesis of yet another of the players in W's administration, that is Paul Wolfowitz.
That's correct, and he was crucial to this because he was, sort of one of the great analytical figures, one of the great intellectuals, you might say, of the bunch, and very much comes into the formulation there. And so we're seeing the outline of what would come home to roost in 2000, and the same group, very, very eager to reassert American power on the world stage, very, very eager to seize these Middle East oil supplies. It's basically, what's interesting about it is it's the same group that worked with a cautious Poppy Bush, then went back in with a very much incautious W. They all had the same loyalties and tied into the same power circles, but it was really a matter of degree, and Poppy was always sort of reticent and cautious, as we know, and the son very much wasn't. And so this whole thing has been sort of misunderstood as them, the father and son, being very different people and having different philosophies. In fact, it was really just them having different sort of, you might say, tolerance for risk. But the ambitions of this group were always the same. And I think what's really important to point out, and I try to do this throughout Family of Secrets, is that none of the names we're talking about are the people who are ultimately really calling the shots. They've all got to answer to extremely powerful figures in the financial and industrial world who control those giant corporations, and very often holding companies and linked into many different companies and banks and what have you, who are absolutely at the center of this entire global military, industrial, intelligence, petroleum, financial complex that back then was really running things and is still running things today.
Let's talk about the education of George Walker Bush. We've spoken about Yale and Skull and Bones. He went to Harvard Business School, and Harvard University as a business entity will come into the discussion later in connection with Harkin. But tell us about George W. Bush and Harvard Business School.
Well, I mean, all of these things are a little bit hard to know exactly what went on. Certainly he was no great shakes there. He didn't seem to take his schoolwork all that seriously. He very much wanted to play out this. He was already sort of practicing this kind of Texas thing, chewing tobacco, wearing cowboy boots and putting them up on the desk, playing country music. He was already sort of, testing this whole thing. He told somebody, actually, I'm trying to remember what year it was, but I think it was right around, actually it was before he went to Harvard Business School. He already told somebody he wanted to run for public office. And so he was very aware that the West was on the rise, the power of the West, and that he was going to have to be much more effective than his father as convincing people that he was a Western politician. So he was practicing that and also I think practicing how to kind of criticize those Eastern elites without people realizing that those Eastern elites were very much actually the same people as you were.
George Bush was not a particularly brilliant business student, and you point out that he was one of the very few people at Harvard Business School who managed to leave without a job. But he went back to what had been very fertile soil for his father and turned out to be for him, too. He goes back to Midland, Texas. Tell us about Arbusto Energy.
Right. Well, the father, had gone out there, and then, see, they're very, very cognizant, as I think Barack Obama was too, of how you create a story that resonates well with people. A lot of people, when you talk about Obama and you try to stress that his establishment credentials, they'll say, but wait a minute, he was a neighborhood organizer. And then you say, well, of course. I mean, if you want to run for office, you have to do something like that. You've got to do something. Public service. I mean, he wasn't in the military, and so he needed something else. It's the same thing with the Bushes. They were very, very aware that they, being born with the silver spoon and all that, they would be attacked for that. So the simple thing is to immerse yourself get your hands dirty. And so Poppy had gone out to Texas, and they created this story about how he worked his way up from the bottom, which was not true very much. He was even flown out there on a family corporate jet. I mean, everything was made very easy for him. And the son was the same thing. So the son tells the story of how he, headed out to West Texas and started his little tiny business in a broom closet-sized room and just struggled from the bottom. But actually, I've studied the records of the company, and you just see one person after another marching in there, writing giant checks. In fact, one fellow came in and he flew in. He was James Baker's college roommate from Princeton, and he flew in and said, "Here's a check for $1 million." Now, keep in mind, this is in the early 70s, and that's still pretty big money, but back then, to just fly in with a check for $1 million into something, it was a total crapshoot. And then the lawyer, the outside lawyer, said to him, "Now I need to explain to you the risks involved." And he said, "Oh," according to the lawyer, this guy said, "Oh, don't bother. It's not my money."
Well, there you go. Nice work if you can get it, and he got it. However, Arbusto Energy didn't turn out to be a particularly profitable oil company. Again, I want to hearken, pun intended, back to some of our earlier discussions about Bush family business ventures, that they don't make a lot of sense from an overt business standpoint, but that when one dollies the camera out, as you have done so effectively in Family of Secrets, Russ Baker, what you see all over with business connections of really several generations of Bushes, you see intelligence connections, big time, as Dick Cheney would say. Arbusto didn't go too far. How about Spectrum 7? Tell us about that development.
Right. So what happened with Arbusto was Jim Bath comes in with some money, and as best as we can figure, anything that he had or that he was investing was on behalf of the Saudis. And so there's the very real possibility that the Saudis secretly put a substantial amount of money, not just into these things involving Bath, but actually into George W. And that would be very important in understanding his policies and his activities as President of the United States vis-a-vis the Saudis, Iraq, and so forth. Anyway, so Arbusto did not make money, was in trouble. Then along came a larger company called Spectrum 7 that bought it out. I encourage people to read the part in Family of Secrets about the figures behind Spectrum 7. They were Cincinnati businessmen, again connected into Yale. They were involved later on with a very interesting reinsurance company with what appear to be intelligence ties. That's a very complex way of also involving large amounts of money. And one of them was appointed when George W. Bush became President of the United States to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, despite the fact he seemed to know nothing about any of that. And so that's Spectrum 7. They give him a nice salary. They've taken his money-losing company. Spectrum 7 isn't making any money. And so eventually it is swallowed up in turn by this company, Harken Energy, which is by far the most fascinating.
Let's talk about the Quashes, Father William and son Alan, and how they figure into this scenario.
Harken Energy was a small and I think sort of regular, you might say, oil company. I flew out to Texas and spent some time in person with the man who had founded it, Phil Kendrick, and he took me through the whole history of the company. He grew up in the oil industry, and it was a viable oil company, but when the oil industry fell on hard times, he began looking for outside financing, and when he had a subsidiary in Asia, and as he was traveling around Asia, somehow the name Quasha had come up, and he'd heard about a man named Quasha, an American who lived most of his adult life in the Philippines, and somebody had told him how Quasha was thought of to be some sort of a front for the vast billions of the Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos, who, of course, those were ill-gotten gains, money transferred from the impoverished people of the Philippines, as well, of course, American tax dollars and so forth, to Marcos. In any case, that was the father, Quasha. Now, along comes a broker from the East Coast, contacts Kendrick and says, I've got somebody who'd like to invest in your company. And he says, great. And he says, yeah, this guy, Alan Quasha. And so this turns out to be the son of the man he'd already heard about in connection with Marcos. Quasha begins taking a position in the company, takes in more and more. The money comes in indirectly from various Caribbean entities. Some of it, blocks of stock, I think in the names of, I have to check again, but I believe the mother and the father, not clear where they would get that kind of money themselves. But in any case, they eventually basically oust Kendrick from his own company, and they go about announcing that the company's doing really, really badly. The stock plummets. They're able to buy more stock at a fraction of the price, and he's out. And then the company begins doing all kinds of interesting things. It makes a deal with George Soros. He had a bunch of loose oil properties. It takes those over, puts him into the company, and then a few years later, it takes over Spectrum 7 and brings George W. Bush into the company. This is in the late 80s, as Marcos is battling for survival in the Philippines, and Bush's father is vice president of the United States. And so they bring him in, they rescue Bush, they give him the best salary he's ever had, and they put him on the board, and they basically require him to do almost nothing at all. And he just takes off and essentially moves to Washington, where he ends up being key senior staff on his father's presidential campaign. And so this Harkin Energy Company is very much set with tremendous influence with that family. And Harkin's quite interesting because, and we can only scratch the surface here, but in Family of Secrets, I have a whole chapter on it where I go into all the people who are involved. And again, we find Saudis, we find people with connections to the Shah of Iran, of Ferdinand Marcos, of the South African apartheid regime, the white supremacist, the exclusive elite of South Africa, a Swiss bank, on and on and on, and many of these figures having intelligence connections, oil connections, connections to dictators, and it's an intriguing outfit. And then finally, as the company needs still more money, Harvard University comes in. And that is probably the most interesting of all, and that's why I devote, I'd say, almost half the chapter to Harvard and what was it doing in this fascinating entity.
Yeah, just very briefly, Robert Stone, the head of the Harvard Management Corporation, another member of the old boy network of the Eastern financial and industrial establishment. Encapsulate him to the extent that one could, perhaps.
Well, I mean, the Boston Globe, the main newspaper in Boston, had looked at this thing. Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, they all looked at Harkin and collectively adjudged it to be one of the strangest things they'd ever seen. Didn't seem to make any money, didn't make any sense. Yet exploded. It went from just a few million to something like $1 billion in revenues, and the question was, what is this thing? It was gobbling up all kinds of companies and so forth, but it wasn't clear what it was exactly and why it very seldom made any money for the outside shareholders. Just very mysterious. And it also, by the way, had a lot of things that we would later see with Enron, these complex sort of separate related partnerships where they were moving profits and losses conveniently for the various entities and partners. But in any case, Robert Stone, he was the reason his name comes up is looking at why Harvard University made the largest investment it ever made in direct private equity investment into this tiny little and unprofitable company. They were trying to figure that out, and they got as far as to the fact that the head of the Harvard Board of Overseers, probably the single most powerful person at Harvard, a man named Robert Stone, might have had something to do with that. Now, he denied it in a very cagey way, and I do a lot of, in Family of Secrets, a lot of assessing the splitting of hairs, the parsing of words, where people are not explicitly lying, but they're being very careful in the way that they couch things to make it hard for us to figure out what's really going on. Robert Stone made it sound like he was nothing. That was the end of the reporting by the mainstream media, but I continued looking, and basically what I discovered was that Robert Stone had an intelligence background himself. And this went all the way back to World War II when I discovered he had worked for General Douglas MacArthur, as I think we pointed out in an earlier episode did Poppy Bush when he worked in basically naval intelligence during the war. And so Robert Stone was also in the same group, as was William Quasha. So Stone and Quasha both worked on General MacArthur's staff at the same time. General MacArthur running his own intelligence operation in the Pacific and keeping the OSS largely out. So all these people knew each other. And what I finally discovered that seemed to connect all of these things was gold.
One of the things you speculate about, and by the way, veteran and regular listeners of the program are very familiar with Gold Warriors by Sterling and Peggy Seagraves. I've read at length from the book and have interviewed both of them on the air. You speculate that, and it is a speculative element, we should stress that, is that the Harkin may have been used as, you go into Harkin as apparently a money laundering vehicle at great length, but one of the speculative elements is that it may have been used to launder some of the gold that was left by General Yamashita, and certainly Bob Stone had a tremendous involvement with the gold industry.
Right. There's a lot of sense that there was gold. I mean, there is gold in the world, and when there's a war, the victors often take the gold, and we do know that the Japanese took gold. We know that the Nazis took gold, and the Japanese took the gold, which was a mainstay of the treasury of so many of these countries that they invaded, and that supposedly moved it. They wanted to keep it somewhere safe, and that the Philippines was where they kept it. There also, the Philippines was a very important gold mining country in its own right. And so there was this reputed, several different sources of vast amounts of gold. And of course, if you have vast amounts of gold, as they say, he who has the gold rules. So the gold is a very important means, again, potentially of funding unauthorized covert operations. And this is a consistent theme in Family of Secrets, the idea that the intelligence apparatus writ large is not under control, and it does whatever it wants, or more appropriately, I should say, it does whatever people in the private sector who have influence inside it want it to do. And the problem is, how do you fund these things? And so you can't fund them openly, you can't fund them using tax dollars, and you can't have the funds being traceable. Well, one of the best ways to do that is in the form of things like gold, which is not easily traceable, and especially if you've got a whole lot of gold that nobody knows even exists. Could be an endless store for your budget. And so I do find gold patterns, and we even see with the junior Quasha years later that he ends up on the board of I can't remember, it was American Express Gold Fund, and we find Stone's connections to gold. We find gold running through all this, and we find also that some of the key investors in Harkin are people from South Africa, again the #1 supplier of gold in the world. And so it's gold, gold, gold all the time, and one wonders whether that was not the whole purpose of the entity in the first place.
You mentioned William Quasha briefly, known to this audience as is the lawyer for the Philippine branch of the Nugan Bank, another of these drugs and intelligence connected banks that we've spoken about. In connection with this networking we've been talking about, in a sense, we're almost looking at the Gold Boys network.
The Gold Boy Network. By the way, another guy who was involved with Quasha, a fellow named Hassan Namazi. Listeners may want to go to our website, whowhatwhy.com, where we are trying to build a journalistic entity to continue looking into all these things and tie them into what's happening right now. And there you'll see an article along the right side of the homepage about Hassan Namazi and about Quasha and some of their other businesses, because they went on to take over a name brand on Wall Street that had sort of fallen on hard times. And then, according to the people who previously ran that company, strange things began to happen there. Several years later, Hassan Namazi becomes described as the key foreign policy advisor to Hillary Clinton. Quasha, obviously close with George W. Bush. And then you see Namazi not very long ago arrested and now very likely going to do some extensive time for millions and millions of dollars of bank fraud. How it is that somebody like that could be involved in this entanglement with all of these banks and so much money and then himself need to defraud a bank is hard to figure, but that's the way life goes sometimes.
Yeah, you also, one of the things we're recalling briefly, because we did touch on the last interview, that in the 70s when Poppy is for a time ascended at CIA, and when this whole BCCI milieu is percolating around, they tarred Burt Lance and Jimmy Carter with some of these same scandal brushes as well. Back to Harvard Management Corporation, Bob Stone, and Harken Energy, and we've got about a little over 3 minutes left on this side. In fact, we've got a little over 3 minutes. Let's perhaps introduce how Harken Energy is. Well, you know what? Let's encapsulate Bahrain, and then in our next interview we'll talk about the Texas Rangers and how Bush, Bush the Younger, ascends the political stage. The Bahrain imbroglio. Can you encapsulate that? Given we've only got a couple of minutes.
Sure. I mean, basically, Harken was given essentially got an exclusive contract to drill for what was believed to be a significant amount of oil off of Bahrain. And this was, instead of going with the big oil companies that made bids, they said they went with Harken because they didn't have any experience, and therefore they felt that they might be more focused on this project. The strangest explanations I've ever heard in business. There was no oil found there, and then in a complicated series of things, George W. Bush appears to have benefited or was alleged to have benefited from inside information pertaining to Harken stock, pertaining to Bahrain, whether there was oil there or not, and that all this was part of his amassing his present fortune.
And ultimately, the stock that George Bush held in Harken Energy, which may very well have been the focal point of the fulcrum of an illegal transaction, but this ultimately was parlayed into a very successful and politically marketable part ownership of the Texas Rangers. Maybe we can introduce that, and then we'll develop that further as we really get into George W. Bush ascendant.
Sure. Well, I mean, the Texas Rangers deal was crucial because he would have had a hard time, George W. Bush, being elected governor and then president on the strength of having run two failed oil companies and then having them taken over by a third company that itself didn't really make any money, and that was so incredibly strange. I don't know if I mentioned Harken also had Saudis in there with big blocks of the stock, and so that company couldn't have borne scrutiny either, and so he needed something else on his resume after that, something more successful, something more all-American, and that is the Texas Rangers, which we can go into further.
Yep. We have been speaking with Russ Baker, the author of Family of Secrets, subtitled The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Russ, tell us about where people can get the website or get the book, and also your website.
Family of Secrets should be in local bookstores. If it's not, you can ask them to carry it, and they will. And it's also available online, Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, and so forth. I try to support independent bookstores. And you can go to our website, familyofsecrets.com, click there and order through that. Then our website, whowhatwhy.com, whowhatwhy.com. That's our new nonprofit investigative reporting site, publicly supported, and go there and sign up for our mailing list.
And let me also stress to the listening audience, we are concluding the 5th interview that we've done. We have one more that we're going to be doing. I do think that we could fairly say, Russ Baker, that we have scratched the surface of Family of Secrets, but we really haven't done any more than that. And in 6 hours, which we will have in the can by the time we're finished, is a lot of interviewing about a book. But then the book itself is about 600 pages, and the footnotes go on and on and on and on. But so if listeners are wondering, well, what else is there? There's plenty else there, because really we've not only we've scratched the surface, but no more than that. But many of the things that we've touched on, for example, the Watergate affair, the entire concatenation, the entire construction that George H.W. Bush put together to cover his presence in Dallas, are dealt with at length and in detail and present a very compelling narrative. A lot of this, though, Russ Baker, I don't think is easy to talk about on the radio, because in order to understand it, you have to get into the detail. But you have certainly done that in Family of Secrets, and we'll get into some more of that in our next interview. This concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 715, interview with Russ Baker. This is being recorded on June 6th of the year 2010. For Russ Baker, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening.